morning's gospel lesson is John chapter 8, verses 31 through 39. Then Jesus said to the Jews who had believed in him, "If you continue in my word, you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will make you free." They answered him, "We are descendants of Abraham and have never been slaves to anyone. What do you mean by saying, 'You will be made free'?" Jesus answered them, "Very truly I tell you, everyone who commits sin is a slave to sin. The slave does not have a permanent place in the household. The Son has a place there forever. So if the Son makes you free, you will be free indeed. I know that you are descendants of Abraham, yet you look for an opportunity to kill me, because there is no place for you in you for my word. I declare what I have seen in the Father's presence. As for you, you should do what you have heard from the Father." They answered him, "Abraham is our father." Jesus said to them, "If you were Abraham's children, you would be doing what Abraham did." The Old Testament lesson is Genesis chapter 22, verses 1 through 14. After these things, God tested Abraham. He said to him, "Abraham," and he said, "Here I am." He said, "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I shall show you." So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him, and his son Isaac. He cut the wood for the burnt offering, and set out and went to the place in the distance that God had shown him. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place far away. Then Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you." Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. So the 2 of them walked on together. Isaac said to his father Abraham, "Father," and he said, "Here I am, my son." He said, "The fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering?" Abraham said, "God himself will provide the lamb for a burnt offering, my son." So the 2 of them walked on together. When they came to the place that God had shown him, Abraham built an altar there and laid the wood in order. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar, on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to kill his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, "Abraham, Abraham." And he said, "Here I am." He said, "Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." And Abraham looked up and saw a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide." And it is said to this day, "On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided."
Everything comes down to love. Then just what am I afraid of? When I call out your name, something inside awakens my soul. How quickly I forget I'm yours. I'm not my own. I've been carried by you all my life, and everything rides on hold now. Everything rides on faith somehow. When the world has broken me down, your love sets me free.
Paige, I gotta tell you, this is how the Holy Spirit works in strange ways. When I was working on my sermon this week, that song from Madison Road was on my heart. Thank you. I'd like to invite the littlest members of our congregation to come forward if you'd like now. Join me up here if you want to. I know we got two in the back. If you guys want to come forward, I promise. I haven't bitten anybody since I was 10 years old because my brother lived. No, that's okay. That's okay. If you don't want to, that's fine. It's all right. No worries. I'll catch you afterwards, okay? That's good. Let's go ahead. Let's move ahead in order of service then to our hymn, which is number 503 in the black hymn. In our gospel lesson, Jesus, in speaking to the people, evokes Abraham. And the people say, "We have Abraham as our father. What are you talking to us about?" And Jesus reminds them about God's relationship with Abraham. And the deepest part of that relationship is found in our Old Testament lesson this morning from Genesis 22. And perhaps as a child, you heard this in vacation Bible school yourselves, or in Sunday school. We've heard it as adults. And honestly, this is a passage that we could do many Sundays in a row on and never repeat ourselves. But what I'm about to do here may sound a little funny, but I want you to bear with me as we go back to the beginning of that chapter, to the opening verses when God calls Abraham. And I'm going to put a little revelatory spin on it so we understand what God is asking and what Abraham is thinking. God calls to Abraham, "Abraham!" And Abraham responds in typical Jewish fashion of the Old Testament, "Here I am." This is the same word that the prophet Isaiah uses when he is in the temple and has that vision, and God says, who shall we send and who will go for us? And Abraham says, here I am. It's a shout of, yes, I'm excited to hear from you, God. And God said to Abraham, Abraham, take your son. Which one, Lord? I have Isaac and I have Ishmael. Your only son. Ishmael, Isaac. Isaac, the one you love. Oh, yeah, Isaac, okay. And in that moment, Abraham realizes, or understands again, or is reminded that God's promise that he has promised Abraham over and over for many years is going to be fulfilled through Isaac, the son that Abraham loves deeply. And so we can imagine Abraham's reaction when God tells him next, this is what I want you to do with the son you love. Now, none of us here hopefully have ever been asked to do what Abraham was asked to do. None of us hopefully have ever been asked or needed to kill a child, let alone our own child. So we might have a hard time identifying with Abraham in this particular instance, not having gone through what he went through. So let's take a look at this passage, though, understanding that not only does this offer a challenge to Abraham, a deep, hard challenge, but it also offers one to us as well. Now, you may remember Abraham chose to follow God. He had been called by God many years ago, many hundreds, maybe thousands of miles away in Mesopotamia. And this God called him and said, go. And Abraham said, I will go. And he went and traveled, moving away from his ancestral home, moving away from his family and his extended family. So all he had was his immediate family and his possessions. And he went. And repeatedly, over those years after he had left home, he demonstrated to God his faithfulness. He demonstrated that he trusted this God who had called him. So why does God test Abraham now in this way, in such an extreme manner? And didn't God know that Abraham was faithful? Didn't God know that Abraham trusted him? What did God need to know or learn or prove by testing Abraham in this way with his son Isaac? And implicit in our question when we ask it that way, implicit is our own sense of frustration at God and protest against God. Perhaps we've even had those moments in our own lives, whether it's maybe disease such as cancer or unemployment or a financial crisis in our lives or a crisis of relationships, whatever it is, there's a point at which we say to God, come on, God, enough's enough. So what is God trying to do? What does he want Abraham, what does he want those of us reading this passage to understand? Now, many interpreters, especially in recent times, want us to see this story as a foreshadowing of the New Testament, a foreshadowing of the Gospels. Remember, Jesus said, if you knew Abraham, you would do what Abraham had done. And did not God do the same thing? God was not only willing, but actually did sacrifice his only son, the one he loved, Jesus, and did it for the sake of us, for the sake of all humanity. So God didn't ask Abraham to do anything here that God wasn't willing to do himself, and actually did. But I think that foreshadowing maybe misses something. It's absolutely true that this passage, in many scholars' minds, more so than any passage of the Old Testament, gets to the heart of the gospel. But it misses the nature. Talking about foreshadowing misses the nature of Abraham's relationship with God, and more importantly, God's relationship with Abraham, and thereby God's relationship with all of us. Because the gospel is not about us. The gospel and the scriptures are not about us and our relationship to God, but God's relationship to us, to humanity. And we Christians sometimes forget that. We Christians, especially those of us who have grown up in the church, from the time when we were little to the time now when we are tall or bent over. Over the years, we can get into patterns of our faith, patterns of behavior, patterns of rituals, things that almost become, for want of a better term, a habit. And habits can be good and habits can be not so good. Living our life, our faith, without thinking has both potential and a pitfall. It can be a good thing in that we practice our faith so often that it becomes an instinct. It becomes ingrained into us, a part of who we are, that we can do it, that everything we do lives out our faith. Much as like a sports figure, like a baseball player or a golfer or somebody else like that, has to practice over and over and over again until that swing becomes instinctive, until that using your voice when you sing becomes instinctive, that it becomes full. Or playing that instrument can be done without even thinking about it. And our faith can be that same way, that instinctive act of faith, that the Holy Spirit just kind of lives through us without our even needing to work at it. And that's a wonderful thing. And we work at that every day. And none of us ever quite reach that point. But that is life, working every step, every day, a little more faithful, a little more faithful. But the pitfall of habit is it can become just a thing we do and don't even think about it. We can become complacent. We can take things for granted. How many marriages in our society get into trouble for this because one spouse forgets that the other spouse is there and just assumes, well, they're always going to be there. They're always going to be in bed next to me. They're always going to be there with me at dinner, whatever. And we take that person for granted and we don't put the effort into our relationship with that other person. And the same thing can happen in our faith. We take God for granted and we can neglect the one who loves us so incredibly much. And so that latter habit is where God's testing comes in. Abraham has followed God, has gone when God has said go, over and over, so it almost becomes a habit. And after Abraham, after each of us, so many times has gone when God has said go, there's still one larger question left to answer. What are we willing to give when God says give? And implicit in that question is the question, what are we not willing to give when God says give? What are we willing to sacrifice in our own lives? We in the United States don't face the obstacles that many in the world face as Christians. The number of Christians that were killed because of who they are in the 20th century registers in the millions. And yet none of us has ever had to stand up and face the choice between Christ or being killed. What are we willing to sacrifice? Are we willing to die for our faith? Many of us might say we would. Many of us might say, if I had a gun put to my head and told, renounce Jesus or die, I would willingly die. But when I get up in the morning, what am I willing to give up for God? What enjoyments am I willing to sacrifice? What little gadgets that I so love to use? Might I not be willing to give up for God, and God says give it? God will not demand your death. God will not demand you kill your child like he asked Abraham to do, but God will ask for blood. He will ask for our blood and sweat and tears. He asks each of us to examine our lives and to note in our lives, what is it that is most precious? What is it that I am least willing willing to part with? What do I hold on to the tightest? And then he asks us to surrender that, to sacrifice it, to give it to him, to let it go. Not just willing to give and say, as in saying, well, yeah, God, I'd be willing to do that. Not as an intellectual exercise, but as a heart exercise of surrendering our heart to do as Abraham did. He not only said he believed God's promise, he acted on it. God promised Abraham, I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars. And then God says to him, sacrifice your only son. Abraham was not in his 20s. Abraham was not in his 30s. Abraham was not even in his 60s. He was nearly a century old. How would he have another son if God asked him to kill this one? And yet Abraham said, in his heart and in his hands, I will do this. He demonstrated his belief. He lived and acted in complete trust in God. Even when God asked him to do something that seemed exceedingly crazy and insane and just completely maybe wrong, Abraham did it, trusting that what God asked was actually right. And when the passage says that Abraham reached out his hand, it does not mean he raised his hand over his head. It meant he reached his hand out and laid that knife on his son's throat. That Isaac was a hair's breadth from death. That Abraham was right there, about to draw the knife, about to do what God asked of him. He was willing and ready and going to sacrifice his only son, the most precious part of his life. And I want you to note, though, in that moment, in that passage, go back and read it and notice Isaac's reaction. Aside from that one question that Isaac asks his father, Isaac doesn't say a word, especially not in that moment when Abraham reaches out with the knife. The chronicler mentions nothing of Isaac's reaction to being bound hand and foot and laid on the pile of wood. Isaac, in that moment, knew the answer to the question he asked his father earlier. When he asked his father, where is the lamb for the sacrifice? In that moment, Isaac knew, I am the sacrifice. And in his silence, we see and we hear his own trust in his father and his own trust in the God of his father Abraham. Isaac and Abraham both gave everything for God. They laid everything on the line for this God who seemed to be so demanding, who seemed to ask the most painful of sacrifices. Now, sacrifice in that time, animal sacrifice was quite common. We see throughout the Old Testament the number of times that people were asked to sacrifice themselves at the temple of God. And in that culture around Abraham at that time, even human sacrifice was not out of the question. But here in this passage, God demonstrated to Abraham, demonstrates to all of us, that he is not like other gods. He is the opposite of the other gods, not only of that time, but he is the opposite of the false gods of our own culture today. This God is not one who demands and demands and demands from us, seeking to test us till we break, seeking destruction, seeking his own gratification. But this is God who, in asking for sacrifice, brings newer, larger life. It is the act of a surrendering God to ask Abraham to do what he did. To ask Abraham to do what God was willing to do and did. It is in this act of our own surrendering to God that which is most precious in our own lives, that is when we discover just truly who God is. And in doing so, find that life that is more abundant that Jesus talked about. And God says in that moment, because you have done this, because you have withheld nothing from me, who created you, and gave you all that you have and are, because you have done this, I will surely bless. God made this promise to Abraham again, more fully. Abraham, I am so going to bless you like you can't imagine. But in those words, when God says, I will bless you, he's not speaking solely to Abraham. He's speaking to all those who would follow Abraham. Follow Abraham and his descendants, but all those who would follow in Abraham's example. And so God continues, I will bless, and all the nations of the earth through you will be blessed. And that word there, the nations, is not the geopolitical entity we think of today, but the goyim. All people, all families, all clans, all tribes, all communities, all the world will be blessed through Abraham and through what Abraham did. And we see this blessing made most manifest in the life and the death and the resurrection of God's only Son, Jesus. In that incarnation, we see God's miraculous self-giving of himself, holding nothing back, betting everything on an act that requires God to give everything of himself, to become human, fully, wholly, and completely. This is not God with skin on. This is not a God puppet. But Jesus is fully God, and yet at the same time, fully, exactly, 100% down to the DNA like us. And in that act, God does something that is fraught with peril. The Son dies and descends to the depths of death, a place no human has ever gotten out of. But in this act, God does something that is outrageous. Jesus returns from the dead, comes back triumphant even over death itself, the one thing that nobody has ever conquered before. Is God risking all of this, risking all of creation, everything he has done from the moment he said, let there be light, to the end of time, risking all of it for our sake, for the sake of the world he created, and for every single one of us who is in this world. And God pours out upon this world blessing. He pours it out upon those of us who demonstrate, who work at living out complete trust in God, who work at surrendering a little more each day to God. And he makes those who surrender in this way gadol. The Hebrew word that we translate as great, but means so much more than just great. Tremendous, humongous, large, overwhelming. He makes us gadol. Those who live faithfully, God uses greatly, working in us as a people, not for our own sake, but that we might be gadol to the world, a great blessing to the world. This is our call. This is our act of surrender. Not to give up ourselves and to lose, but to gain something greater. To be used by God in this world around us that is so hungry to hear what God has done, to know what God has done, to experience that kind of love. He works in us, his church, his body, to be a great blessing. To all our friends, to all our families, to all our neighborhoods, to all our schools, to all our jobs, to all our communities, to all nations, to all the world. May God's blessing go out from us in all those places and more. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.